Nationals. My name is David Baker. I am the Director of Admission and Financial Aid at St. Mark's School of Texas in Dallas, Texas. I coached at St. Mark's. I coached the debate teams at St. Mark's for 16 years, and all the rest of it's pretty much irrelevant. So welcome to the quarterfinals. About 15, 20 minutes ago, I think, the two teams flipped for sides. And at this time, I'd like to invite the teams to introduce themselves. The affirmative team from Potomac Oak High School, the affirmative team from Potomac Oak. Would you please introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, my name is Emily.
Hello, my name's Amanda.
Hi, I'm Kristen.
Welcome. I'd like to now ask the members of the negative team from Troy High School to introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, my name is Sohan.
Hi, my name is Om.
Hi, my name is Nihira.
Well, welcome. We'd like to remind you and our judges and team members to stay on mute unless you're speaking or prepping to speak. Of course, during the cross-examination, everybody needs to unmute their lines. It's kind of important that we stay on top of that. Nothing can delay these things faster than everybody trying to figure out who needs to be muted and who's not. Each of you has received a copy of the oral debate format, and we'll now begin with the opening presentation by the affirmative team. I'm going to time here, but I'm assuming that your timing as well, so I'm not going to give you any signals at all. Does anyone need signals? Any of the six of you, would you need signals? Everybody has a way to time keep yourself. Does that all work? Okay, I am going to time it, but the only signal you're going to hear from me is to stop if once you reach your time limits, okay? So with no further ado, we'll start with opening speeches. We'll begin with the affirmative for a period not to exceed 5 minutes. You may start when ready.
Great. All right. Can everybody hear me clearly? Great. Advancing medical innovation and finding solutions for pandemics and climate change is the greatest challenge of our time and requires an equally great technological revolution. Thus, Potomac Oak affirms. First is an overview. International coalitions are successfully implementing comprehensive AI regulation. 42 countries collaborated on standards for AI policies that prevent abuses by designing AI systems to respect human laws and implementing safeguards such as human override. Individual nations are also trending towards stringent regulation, as all governments have incentives to regulate. Even irrational actors care enough about themselves to prevent crises at the hands of unregulated AI. A holistic analysis conducted by DC research firm Cognilytica finds every single country has already implemented successful AI regulations. History proves that regulation is feasible. The Industrial Revolution saw legislators enforcing adaptive policies to combat externalities from new technology. And as powerful AI continues to revolutionize the world will continue to respond with equally powerful policies. Contention 1 is the healthcare revolution. The World Bank reports that half of the world's population cannot afford essential health services, and 100 million are pushed into extreme poverty each year because of health expenses. Moreover, pandemics are becoming more frequent and severe due to things like globalization and urbanization. Fortunately, AI galvanizes innovation and expands access to the world's medically underserved populations. Global investment in medical AI will reach $6.6 billion this year, with 75% of healthcare organizations investing in it. Subpoint A is bridging the gap. AI-driven telemedicine is life-saving for populations lacking physical health infrastructure, such as areas in low-income countries. Dr. Eric Widman of the University of Notre Dame reports Google's Seeing Potential machine learning algorithm is already screening for blindness in 70 million diabetic patients in rural India. They're also more accurate at diagnoses. Algorithms that remotely monitor patients to detect heart and lung conditions for free have 99% accuracy compared to 70% from humans. Furthermore, the vast troves of data AI collects allows governments to better allocate healthcare infrastructure, implement effective sanitation measures, and pinpoint disease-causing factors. Subpoint B is drug development. Innovation is declining. 90% of drug candidates fail under traditional systems, costing companies up to $2.6 billion per drug. Revitalizing drug discovery is essential because 1, overuse of antibiotics has created drug-resistant bacteria that will kill 10 million annually by 2050. 2, an aging population and changes in societal behaviors have increased chronic conditions by 57%, which 1 in 3 suffer from. 3, the World Health Organization notes infectious disease outbreaks have been increasing in number and novelty, killing more than 17 million annually. Crucially, AI promotes effective drug discovery by identifying more promising drug candidates and speeding up the current process. It can screen 20 million genetic compounds daily, producing results 100 times faster. AI has furthered drug development for various cancers and conditions like ALS. Thus, Nick Fleming of the Nature Scientific Journal explains it's no surprise that almost all major biopharmaceutical players are using AI. Subpoint C is pandemics. AI can diagnose pandemic patients faster, predict the spread of disease earlier, find treatments more effectively, promote remote healthcare access, and increase hospital capability. Critically, the corona pandemic has killed over 3.2 million people so far, and without sufficient AI safeguards, future pandemics will pose existential risks. Contention 2 is environmental sustainability. Professor Richard Parncutt of the University of Graz warns climate change already causes 400,000 deaths annually, and this number will skyrocket to over 153 million for every 0.5 degrees Celsius increase. Subpoint A is clean power. AI is unlocking the vast potential of renewables. For example, it can find the best sites for hydropower dams to produce the lowest emissions, making hydropower more widely used. Power grids integrating renewables have trouble maintaining constant energy flow and resilience against extreme conditions, but AI can support the active management of electricity grids by utilizing algorithms to predict energy production and improve the accessibility of renewable energy sources. Already, Cho of Columbia University finds AI has created a flexible and autonomous electric grid in Norway that easily integrates renewable energy. Thus, AI can reduce global CO2 emissions by 20%. Subpoint B is agriculture. Agricultural production will inevitably be affected by extreme weather due to climate change, jeopardizing not only the global food supply, but also the livelihoods of 2 billion people. Fortunately, AI will revolutionize agriculture and ensure our survival. AI can monitor crops' overall needs and alert farmers of abnormalities. Hyperlocal weather forecasting also aids farmers' decision-making. For example, AI precision agriculture that provided information such as sowing dates helped farmers in India reap 30% more produce per hectare. Moreover, in places especially affected by climate disasters, AI models can predict crop yields months before harvest, allowing us to pinpoint low-yield areas, prevent food and resource waste, and plan the management of food supply ahead of time. For these reasons, Potomac Oak is proud to affirm.
Thank you very much. We'll now have the opening presentation from the negative. 5 minutes. Start when ready.
I just want to clarify that you can hear me.
Can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. For the purposes of this debate, we define artificial intelligence as an autonomous technology able to interpret inputs and exhibit flexible behaviors to achieve a particular objective. Although we agree that current applications should be used for a basis of feasibility, AI and its applications are still developing. Therefore, the resolution must be weighed with both current and future applications in mind. The likelihood must be considered to an extent. The sheer magnitude of negative contentions outweigh any lower probabilities. Based on precedent, the potential negative consequences are so catastrophic that the risks of global instability, economic collapse, and blatant disregard of human rights outweigh comparatively inconsequential benefits. Thus, Troy negates the resolution. To begin, we fundamentally disagree with the regulatory context the affirmative provides. The OECD agreement is explicitly non-binding and lacks China and Russia, two of the largest players in the AI space. In regards to the recently proposed EU regulations, Mueller from the Center for Data Innovation explains that the proposal is deliberately vague, as regulators are unwilling to cripple Europe's AI industry. Several individual nations have proposed frameworks, none have implemented them. Unless the US and China uncharacteristically agree to a binding agreement, the status quo will remain. In reality, as shown by the Paris Climate Accords, countries are willing to prioritize short-term self-interest if they are not bound. Our first contention is AI's military impact. Our first military sub-contention is the unsafe development of AI. Ohio State's Grimsley explains that AI is the next opportunity for governments to establish invaluable military asymmetry, meaning governments are under immense pressure to disregard safety for breakthroughs. The Congressional Research Service explicitly states intent to be the first to develop military AI applications may result in comparatively less safe applications. Every variable that increases the risk of AI disaster in simulations is also present in reality. According to Cambridge's Cave and O'Harity, AI's relationship with military development discourages the inclusive multi-stakeholder deliberation necessary for safe development. Furthermore, the high number of nations and corporations competing for dominance significantly worsens all factors, making our reality the most dangerous scenario. Our second military subcontention is lethal autonomous weapon systems or laws. Despite European Court of Human Rights rulings and UNHRC condemnations, nations like South Korea and Israel use laws to enforce de facto kill zones, the latter of which targets Palestinian refugees by neither marking nor fencing the border. The CRS warns that weapons adaptable AI tools are accessible to civilians, major military powers, and non-state actors. Al-Qaeda, Shinrikyo, and countless other malicious actors have pursued and will pursue advanced weapons technologies regardless of regulation. Our second contention is AI's economic impact. Our first economic subcontention is that AI will create unprecedented disparities through monopolization and structural unemployment. According to a joint Harvard and Oxford paper and Open Markets Institute, AI's high fixed costs and increased price sensitivity disproportionately reallocates market shares to large firms with few employees. The ITU explicitly states that AI requires substantial cost and upfront investment. According to the International Labor Organization, this barrier to entry stifles free market competition, labor regulation, and taxation, which contribute to wealth disparities. Furthermore, Northwestern's Professor Gordon found conclusive evidence of a trade-off between productivity and unemployment rates, meaning AI will destroy more jobs than it creates. In a UN meta-analysis of 12 studies, 10 predicted a minimum net AI-induced unemployment of 40%, with some estimates reaching 70%. Some experts, including Carnegie Mellon Professor Wadhwa, forecast 80 to 90% unemployment. The Brookings Institution explains that low-wage earners are 3 times more likely to face automation, and racial minorities are 20% more likely to encounter AI-induced unemployment, further exacerbating economic disparities. The IMF states that AI-induced GDP growth is directly correlated with exacerbated inequality, and that stifled demand for low-skilled labor will tank spending and trigger contraction. Our third contention is AI's ethical impact. Our first ethical subcontention is the use of government surveillance. Digital privacy is a UDHR right, and nearly every nation, including China, legally establishes the right to consent. However, this did not stop China from using AI to support a surveillance state in Xinjiang and the ethnic cleansing of millions of Uyghurs. Uganda, Venezuela, and most recently Myanmar imported this technology to crack down on political dissent. The LAPD also uses facial recognition software over 30,000 times since 2009, while simultaneously denying its use. The Huawei, Clearview, Intel, and NVIDIA's development of these systems is proof that private corporations are willing to disregard ethics for profit. Our second subcontention is misinformation. The UDHR establishes the right to obtain information through any media. AI-enabled misinformation directly undermines the credibility of the internet as a source of information, violating Article 19. 48% of Americans encountered misinformation within the first 2 weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, and deepfakes, virtually undetectable synthetic media, are publicly accessible and extraordinarily cheap, enabling revenge pornography and the digital undressing of over 100,000 women, including minors. In conclusion, AI's contentions vastly outweigh in comparatively inconsequential benefits. Thus, we negate the resolution.
We now have a 3-minute period for the teams to confer before the affirmative second speech. 3 minutes. Minute and a half remaining. 30 seconds. We'll now have the second speech by the affirmative. This is a 5-minute speech. You may start when you're ready.
Okay, everyone can hear me, right?
I can.
All right, awesome. Time starts now. On the idea of regulation, Negative argues that AI regulation is underdeveloped because countries prioritize self-interest. We agree self-interest is exactly the reason why countries have sought to regulate in the status quo. All nations recognize that AI can be dangerous if not regulated, which is why our more recent evidence from today, from the Harvard Business Review, indicates that international AI coalitions are becoming even more common. Their own evidence argues that international regulation is feasible since even countries with the most nationalistic and selfish leaders will choose to cooperate as they want to maintain stability and reap economic benefits of AI. They say the OECD example, a framework, is non-binding. The point of it is that it's non-binding. It's a framework so that countries can create laws based off that framework. They say that the EU regulations are deliberately vague. We say that they're not vague. In fact, today, what the Harvard Business Review reported is that they've actually implemented a higher tax on businesses that intend on implementing AI in order to regulate it further. But moving on to their individual contentions, on their first contention of the military, we would actually argue that implementation of AI into military applications has the capability to improve defensive capabilities. The Israeli Iron Dome missile defense system, powered by AI, makes use of predictive analytics to accurately shoot down hundreds of unpredictable rocket attacks in civilian airspaces, a feat otherwise impossible with humans. So 86% of missiles were stopped by the Iron Dome, minimizing civilian casualties and saving hundreds of thousands of lives. But on their individual subpoints, on their first subpoint of unsafe development, first of all, Negative fails to provide a single shred of evidence that countries feel incentivized to or are currently disregarding safety precautions in AI development. They cannot name a single country that's done this. This is crucial considering that the main thesis of their argument is fully unsupported by any sort of expert testimony or citation. But second of all, the congressional report they cite concedes that taking a relatively more conservative approach to development results in more capable systems in the long run. Thus, there's no incentive to skirt safety precautions as nations obviously want to have better AI. And this is exactly why the US has chosen to take a slow and steady approach to AI development. On their second subpoint of laws and autonomous weapons, while Negative asserts that regulation is impossible because we lack understanding of AI, this is not true. Their defeatist attitude isn't even supported by their own evidence, which never argues that it's impossible to enact meaningful change, but actually proposes a myriad of possible routes to regulation, including adapting arms controls and combating disinformation. Moreover, we would argue that countries aren't going to ignore regulations, as demonstrated by how Chile and China and all of these countries, dozens of countries, have already called for legally binding bans on AWS use. They say that they won't listen to regulations because they haven't listened to the UN's condemnation of AWS. We tell you that the UN's condemnations aren't legally binding, but as soon as you implement legally binding bans, which are happening in the status quo, these countries are going to listen to it. Therefore, we argue that it's fully plausible to regulate AI weapons to ensure relatively safe use. Moving on to their contention 2 of the economy. First of all, we would argue that AI, with its massive data processing and analytical power, it would allow firms to drive cost efficiencies and improve their products. As costs are cut and productivity is increased, by 2030, AI would contribute to over $16 trillion to the global economy. So rising productivity will enable firms to lower prices and increase wages, overall improving economic conditions for everybody. But again, on their individual arguments, on their subpoint A of monopolization. First of all, AI will not lead to monopolies. AI is becoming increasingly simplified and commodified to make it accessible to all businesses, and the increasing supply of AI engineering labor pushes down the cost of entry. So if anything, AI actually minimizes barriers to entry and allows for a healthy and competitive market. On their subpoint of unemployment. Although AI is projected to displace 75 million jobs, it's actually expected to create 133 million new jobs by 2022. And unlike negative speculative sources on unemployment, the largest empirical study of AI automation concludes that automation is only going to affect around 2% of workers, which is why since the late 1920s, even though we've seen increasing automation, the rate of unemployment has stayed relatively the same. Finally, on their contention 3 of ethicality, on the idea of surveillance. First of all, regulations will prevent surveillance. So you see a bunch of countries, including Brazil, European countries, and numerous US states have already enacted restrictive data privacy laws, including the example they bring up of the LAPD. They've recently voted to restrict the use of facial recognition. But second of all, in the case of Uyghur surveillance, it is clear that the Chinese government, which has been engaging in oppressions against its citizens for decades, will continue to oppress even without the existence of AI. And finally, on misinformation, we would argue, again, there are plenty of ways to spread misinformation besides AI usage. For example, people who want to pursue misinformation have been doing that since the dawn of time. They don't need AI to do this. For these reasons, we strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
Thank you. We'll now have a 3-minute break before we hear the second speech from the negative. We'll now have the second speech from the negative team. 5 minutes. Start when ready.
Can everyone hear me?
I can.
To begin with the negatives military contention, regulation will not suffice for these huge threats. The Harvard Business Review article that the other team cited contradicts itself, stating that the regulation that's being discussed is not effective based on the fact that lawmakers do not even have a broad consensus on what AI is yet. In addition, regulation passed by individual countries is largely ineffective. Russia halved the Convention on AI risks from 10 days to 5, which is a clear indication of unwillingness to accept basic precautions. A former State Department aide in the US warned that there's too little understanding in our ministries to enact meaningful control. And in China, military officials refer to intelligentized warfare as the future of warfare. And Chinese military officials intend to capitalize upon this transformation. The affirmative stated that unsafe development will only be futile if there is conservative development. However, there is clear evidence that there will not be. In addition to general regulation concerns, China does not follow its own binding laws. There is a clearly legally established right to consent in China, but despite this, China is surveilling and committing genocide on its own population of Uyghur Muslims. Just because China passes a certain law does not mean that it will be followed. In response to the economic contention, the affirmative stated that AI will increase productivity. However, according to Gordon, there is a direct trade-off between productivity and employment. So even if wages increase, that means that wages will increase for a few, while others are left unemployed, creating extreme wealth disparity and benefiting only the wealthy while hurting the working class. In response to government surveillance, China, Venezuela, Uganda, Argentina, and Myanmar have already been using government surveillance to oppress their own citizens. This is not a hypothetical. Even in the USA, the LAPD lied for 11 years, and they just revealed that they've been doing this. AI is not some hypothetical that can be regulated in the future with 10 years of preparation. It must be dealt with now, and it is clearly not. In regards to misinformation, AI worsens the problem even if it already exists. Deepfakes are virtually impossible without AI due to the nature of the technology. In response to some negative contentions, affirmative contentions. AI will not help with efficiency and repetitive tasks in healthcare. This is because there's an extremely high fixed cost to AI. Please refer to our economic contention. What this means is that hospitals will not be incentivized to use this technology because it will simply cost them more than hiring more medical professionals. In addition, even if AI is capable of these small benefits, it will not be used due to its inherent black box nature, which means that AI can only receive inputs and produce outputs. There is no explanation as to its thinking. The Deep Patient AI is a perfect example of this. Deep Patient attempted to diagnose schizophrenia, and it was almost perfect, but it was still deemed almost unusable by almost every single medical professional, just because the medical professionals could not justify the conclusions that the AI drew, and they were not willing to take the liability onto themselves. In response to drug development, AI and innovation in general does not guarantee better outcomes. Look to the US. Even with the best healthcare technology in the world, life expectancy for the poor has constantly plummeted. In addition, even once these drugs are discovered, there is extreme price gouging that is furthered by AI. Please refer to the price discrimination subcontention. For example, Zolgensma is $4 million as opposed to the preceding drug, which was only $2 million. Just because it was more effective, it doubled in cost and made it inaccessible to more people, which actually decreases the use of the drug in the first place. In response to greater accuracy, the medical bias of AI is unacceptable. The black box nature that I talked about earlier basically covers up any bias in AI, which means that any AI used in the medical field will not be effective and will not be used by medical professionals.
We will now begin the cross-examination portion. I would ask that the team captains govern yourselves and make sure, in fact, let's do it in some sort of order. Everyone's going to ask a question. Everyone is going to answer a question. And then once we pass that, where 6 people have asked and answered, then we can kind of see how this goes, depending on how much time we have. We have 10 minutes total for this section of the debate, but I am going to ask that the captains kind of police the notion so that question and answers are done in some sort of an order. So how about we start with, since that was the negative, how about an affirmative question for the negative?
Sure. Okay. Should I go? Is there like a set order to
That's
this?
fine. Go ahead.
All right. Awesome. Okay. So, in your second speech, sorry, you talk about how price discrimination will make healthcare more inaccessible. Isn't the price discrimination you're referencing just pharmaceutical companies selling drugs at cheaper prices to developing countries compared to richer countries like the US? Aren't they making medicine more accessible for these poor people?
I'm going to take the answer to this question. In actuality, it is very different. A lot of drugs are only available on the US market, and even on that market, there's a huge disparity in prices for poor people and richer people. Even with prices dropping, which, as we have seen with Zolgensma as introduced in our second speech, prices aren't dropping. Even without that, the difference between drug prices such as 4 million down to 2 million, or with some other drugs 3.1 million to 1.5 million, that is still a certain threshold that only a certain rich population will be able to access. So more than that, similarly, Article 25 of the UDHR lists medical care as a human right. And however, according to the Southwestern Law School Professor Grimes, price discrimination is key to an abusive scheme that purposely limits access to these life-saving drugs. AI is implemented, and colleges, pharmaceutical companies, and numerous other industries price discriminate far more accurately. So the usage of AI is also making it easier for people to price things at a price point that they know people will only just be able to afford, if not at all.
You need a negative question for the affirmative. Someone from the negative team, a question for the affirmative.
Yep, I can take this. So in our constructive, we said that the CRS says that weapons adaptable AI is available to civilians, military powers, and non-state actors. And you proposed in your second speech arms control as an effective means of regulation. We would point out that the nuclear suppliers group, arguably the best form, failed to stop illicit smuggling out of Pakistan's nuclear program. Do you propose any alternative mechanism that would prevent either illicit smuggling of weapons or either the use of open source weapons that we already showed in our constructive are available?
Someone other than Kristen on the affirmative to answer.
Sorry, I actually couldn't hear you because you're cutting out like every other second. Do you mind if you repeat your question?
I apologize. Right. So in our constructive, we said that weapons adaptable AI tools are accessible to civilians and non-state actors. And you proposed arms control as an effective means of regulation. On the other hand, we point out that the nuclear suppliers group has failed to prevent, arguably the greatest arms control, has failed to prevent illicit smuggling out of Pakistan. Do you propose any alternative mechanisms to stopping the illicit use of artificial intelligence weapon systems, or how to prevent open source weapons from being used by malicious actors?
I think the first thing we need to point out is that it's not our evidence that says that arm controls would work, but rather your evidence states specifically that arm controls on artificial intelligence weapons would work. We'd argue specifically on this idea of like Pakistan smuggling out like nuclear weapons. A, we were able to find out that they smuggled these weapons. B, we haven't seen any sort of use of nuclear weapons. They're inherently different from things like AWS. We'd argue that a lot of, like Kristen says in her second speech, a lot of nations have a self-interest to actually cooperate with a lot of regulations, because in doing so, they're able to take a slice of the pie of economic development that comes when you actually comply with regulations and are able to access a lot of AI development.
Okay. Thank you. Someone from the affirmative, the only other, I don't know who's left on the affirmative. Kristen and Emily have both participated at this point. One other person on the affirmative to ask a question to the negative.
Yeah, I'll take a question.
Okay.
So you say that the upfront cost of using healthcare AI is so high, so that's why they'll never be installed. But at the point where, right, it's only an upfront cost and they're more efficient than human doctors by a lot. They aid their work, they do their paperwork for them, which costs human doctors like 2/3 of their time right now, time which could have been spent with patients. Like to the point where it's only an upfront investment, why would it be true that hospitals would not invest in this like time-saving measure?
The one person on the negative that hasn't answered or asked a question yet can answer that question, please.
So although we stated that there is a high upfront cost, we never stated that there is no continued variable cost as we move forward. So what essentially happens is because of this high upfront cost, only the largest companies would even be able to implement this in the first place. Even though it might be more profitable in theory for hospitals to invest in this fixed cost and then save money later on, that's simply not feasible a lot of times. And that's what you see in a lot of other economic examples where even if something is cheaper, if you don't have the initial capital to pay for that fixed cost, you cannot implement it. And then in regards to the variable costs, it's not that much cheaper than using medical professionals just because you still have to hire personnel to maintain this complicated AI algorithm instead of hiring medical personnel. And essentially what that does is just transferring costs from one department to another, which doesn't actually save much money in the long term. So you have higher short-term expenses and almost identical long-term expenses, which means that AI won't be implemented in these healthcare scenarios.
A question from the negative to the affirmative. The question can come from either Troy or
I'll take this one. As for the climate change contention, there are plenty of instances of AI actually harming the environment. So training one language processing AI emits 284 tons of CO2, which is equivalent to 5 times the lifetime emissions of an average car, according to Lu. I mean, AI is also a tool of the fossil fuel industry. It is used to discover new oil fields, extract the oil, and distribute it. And then finally, there is greater efficiency for oil producers. So it's increasing their operations, which releases emissions. And then the oil itself is burned for greater emissions. How can you claim that AI will reduce emissions through renewable energy when there's such significant effects that oppose it?
Amanda or Kristen?
I can take that one. So our evidence indicates, right, that even taking into account all of these potential harms, AI is still all not good for things like renewable energy and reducing emissions by a lot. So even if it leads to like marginal increases in maybe like oil processing gets a bit faster, well, like they can install like dams and like windmills and solar panels in like whole new places and like whole new regions where they weren't there before. They can protect them by predicting like weather events and like natural disasters. So on net, the benefits like outweigh the harms by a lot. So that's why they conclude that even taking into account all the harms you mentioned, carbon dioxide emissions would still decrease by about 20% with like AI. It's all on net.
Emily, a question for the negative.
All right, sure. So let's talk a little bit about your argument on misinformation. Now, you have already conceded in your framing that deepfakes are relatively new technology, but then we've also seen recently a lot of regulation that's very stringent upon deepfakes. So how prevalent is it really going to be in the future?
Sohan?
Yeah, so as far as regulation concerning deepfakes, we haven't, on our side, we haven't seen any regulation whatsoever on deepfakes. We're seeing that 96% of deepfakes are used for illicit pornography that's not consensual, and that there's no evidence that deepfakes are being curbed in any way and to prevent misinformation or any illegal activities.
Thank you very much. Troy, a question from you to Kristen.
Okay, so in our second negative speech, we did talk about,
No,
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
nothing. I can hear you. I wrote something down wrong. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, cool, thank you. So in our second negative speech, we did talk about bias, and we did hear you respond to that slightly, but one of the things that we did also mention was that the Obermeyer risk assessed harmed 4.6% of patients, even after bias correction. And considering that this still accounts for millions upon millions of patients, why is this an acceptable level? Or,
Kristen?
Am I allowed to clarify her question?
Sure.
Are you talking, what sort of bias are you talking about here?
if you remember in our negative speech, we talked about bias towards like generally people of color, also just racial bias in general. Also, there has been like low income is associated with that as well. So any response in that sense?
Sure. So what I would say is, first of all, you're only pointing out one specific algorithm that has an example of this bias. Whereas there are plenty of working algorithms that are being implemented right now that don't have this sort of bias. In fact, like we talk about, one of these AI algorithms has a 99% accuracy when it's diagnosing heart conditions. But second of all, something else we would say is that it's a lot harder to deprogram biases out of humans and like human doctors than it is to deprogram biases out of AI. So we would argue that in terms of biases and racial biases or socioeconomic biases, whatever you're talking about here, it's going to be a lot easier to sort of sort through these things with AI because you can just deprogram it. You can just feed it data that's not biased, whereas humans, that's not possible to do that at all.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for being so good about spacing these out. We're not going to have time for additional questions one to the other, but we will now begin a period of questions from the judge panel. This will be about 20 minutes. We'll make sure that there are 5 questions at least directed to both sides, and then we'll try to space them out as best we can. So one of my colleagues has a question for either team. Please say which side you're asking the question to, and we will start when you're ready. Go right ahead.
I can start. I'll start with a question for the negative. So you presented some evidence in the cross-examination period about the reasons that AI might not be great for the climate. I wonder if you could provide a source and sort of unpack whether that evidence says it will be comparatively worse, or whether that evidence just says that there are some fossil fuel CO2 costs along the way. Can I get a little unpacking of that, negative team?
Yeah, I think I can answer this. I think because we're talking about like the continuing implementation of AI, we don't necessarily have a definitive estimate that we can give you, but what we can tell you is that the idea that AI is only being used to help the environment is unequivocally false. You have AI being used by companies like Royal Dutch Shell to find new gas fields, and through that you get a dual effect where you have production of gas and also the gas itself that's into the climate. So there are multiple sides to this argument, and I think that what we're trying to convey is that AI won't necessarily help climate change, and even then, governments are unwilling to solve climate change in the first place.
Okay, I guess just to sort of follow up on that, does your evidence say what the net direction of the effect is? Because it seems like the affirmative's evidence says that despite, everyone getting access to it, the net effect is in the direction of reducing CO2. Do you have evidence that talks about the net effect on that question?
One sec.
Am I allowed to answer a follow-up?
Of course.
Okay, I can take this follow-up then. There's actually several different things that we haven't gotten to fully discuss yet. So one thing would be the rebound effect, which basically states that as the perception of energy becoming cleaner grows, the actual consumption of that energy grows. So for that, we have a quantitative value we can give you. If the energy is just marginally cleaner, then the rebound effect goes up to 76%. So what that means is all of the advancements that AI is making in terms of renewable energy and decreasing the fossil fuel consumption, 76% of that will be completely negated just by this one rebound effect. And then obviously on top of that, you have increased AI emissions and new oil drilling sites.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it. I can ask a question to the F, Andy, or if you want to go and ask one to either side, and then I'll ask the next one. Either way, whichever your preference.
You can go. I'll take the next
Okay.
one.
Okay, so question for the AF. You talked about, so the neg said that AI creates military asymmetries, and your example of why it does not do that is that it gave Israel much greater defensive capabilities. It seems like that's an example of asymmetry rather than a refutation of it, because it demonstrates that a previously even playing field is now no longer even, because Israel has the same offensive capabilities or better, and now has the ability to knock down other people's weapons. Why is that not inherently destabilizing as per the way the negative has described it?
I think what's really key here to note is that like AWS is used as defensive capabilities. Like for example, their own evidence is about how like it's supposed to defend certain areas of like a country. It's not meant to like instigate anybody. It's only meant to deter conflict. And so what's really important about that, it means that there's not really any sort of asymmetry being created insofar as they're only trying to deter conflict, right? It doesn't like incentivize any sort of government to go out and attack them, but rather it's actually doing a really good job of preventing any sort of civilian casualties, like Kristen brings up in her second speech. But then we'd also argue that like
just to clarify, is your argument that defensive capabilities cannot be destabilizing?
It's just this argument that it's like, yeah, essentially that it's like it deters any sort of conflict and prevents civilian deaths rather than cause any sort of conflict. But we'd argue they also don't bring up any sort of specific conflict scenario either. So we're not really sure where, like, what kind of impact like military asymmetry is going to cause, insofar as there's already a lot of like military asymmetry like across the world, but we don't see like wars erupting all across the globe either.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it.
Are we allowed to respond to that? I mean, if we're allowed to.
Well, not unless there's a question. These aren't speeches. Andy, do you have a question?
So I have a question for the affirmative around negatives contention around of economic impact. So I know you responded to their contention around, you know, AI destroying more jobs than it creates, with your evidence that it actually creates more jobs. But they also had this other point around inequality. And I know, you know, you had mentioned that it would add $16 trillion to the global economy. It was going to, you know, grow the global economy. But I was curious if you had any thoughts around the distribution of that, or the net impact to inequality.
Okay, I can take this one. So in terms of economic inequality, one thing that we do say in a rebuttal is that AI would break down a lot of these barriers that are currently present in the status quo. So for instance, like AI is being commodified, and like a lot of what it offers, its services, are being commodified and simplified to make it accessible to all businesses. Another example of this is AI is increasing, like AI is able to predict credit scores, so first-time lenders and small businesses can receive loans. So I think one example of this was in M-Shwari in Kenya. It gave loans to about 21 million Kenyans so that they could start their own small businesses. So I would say that because AI is breaking down a lot of these barriers, these economic barriers, it would enable a lot of people, and in fact, it would probably decrease economic inequality.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for the negative. Assuming that you win in this debate, that the economic consequences are significant, and assuming that you win in this debate, that there are some serious, human rights issues that are associated with surveillance, et cetera, as a result of the continued expansion of artificial intelligence. How do I weigh that? How do I decide how important that is versus healthcare, drugs, the environment, and agriculture?
Right, so I can respond to this. So I think the way that we weigh this would really be the feasibility of the application. Of course, both teams take like a somewhat existential approach with very high magnitude, But as far from our perspective, the probability is greatly different. Applications of climate change, we see there's plenty of precedent that countries are unwilling to.
Yeah, I understand that. You're making arguments against the climate change argument. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, how do I weigh the economy arguments, the monopolies, the unemployment, et cetera, and the ethics arguments, surveillance, et cetera? How do I weigh that against them? Not are their contentions true or not? How do I assess those two arguments versus what the affirmative is claiming?
If you don't mind, I would like to take this.
Go ahead.
Okay, so one of the most important aspects of the negative argument is that every single one of our contentions relies on the fact that AI starts these problems, whereas the affirmative ones rely on the fact that they are mitigating some of the issues that they bring out. One of our contentions outweighs all of theirs just because our contentions are based in the usage of AI, while theirs are based in the usage of AI to fix current situations. Negative arguments create issues, and as we also mentioned with the feasibility, regulation will not be able to address their issues, which is why the negative contentions outweigh the affirmative in all of their own regards.
Good. I have one other question I'd like to ask I guess I'm still asking the negative. Or no, I guess I'm asking the affirmative. Sorry, erase that and put that there. To the affirmative, there is some cross application that happens in the second speech concerning the military applications of artificial intelligence. And it seems to me, I mean, I'm just, maybe it's only me, that maluse of artificial intelligence in military applications was potentially incredibly dangerous, maybe certainly more visibly dangerous than something like long-term environmental impacts or surveillance or anything like that. And it seems to me like you're applying these everybody will play by the rules arguments to that. Why wouldn't I logically assume that the people who might do the most dangerous things with military applications of AI would be the least likely people to go along with regulations, et cetera? Wouldn't the onus of military secrecy cut against that argument? I mean, at exactly the place where it would be the most damaging?
Right, I can take that question.
Sure.
So we're saying that as for like rogue nations who might want to use technology for their own benefit, so many other countries are like, they have such an incentive to prevent that from ever happening. They can use other public policy measures such as like sanctions. We've traditionally used them against nations like Iran with their nuclear program and like North Korea, and it's been like pretty like generally effective in the past. So because there's such like a global consensus that no one wants like AI escalation to the extent that the negative talks about, like there will always be policy and like regulations from countries who want to keep the peace to stop the few who don't want to keep the peace from like ever escalating to that extent.
David, can I ask a follow-up question about that? So the examples of countries that you talked about in your speech that are pursuing binding regulations right now or have pursued binding regulations seem to me to be smaller countries that would benefit from binding regulations because they're sort of behind in the AI race. I'm wondering what evidence you've read that China, the United States, perhaps the EU, that kind of thing, Israel, are pursuing the binding, Russia, are pursuing binding regulations rather than countries like Brazil that might be not quite as far ahead in the AI race right now.
Yeah, I can answer this one. So I think in our speech, we actually bring up that it's not just the small countries like less cloudy countries like Brazil that are trying to enact regulations. It's also a lot of countries that have a lot of military might. So for instance, you bring up China. China has actually said that they want to pursue a legally binding regulation on laws usage, right? They don't want laws usage. And even like European countries, like I'm pretty sure the EU has laid out in their frameworks that they want to impose laws against this. And the reason for this and what we're trying to push here, the narrative we're trying to push here, is that these countries are self-interested, but this self-interest means that they don't want like a global war to break out because of AWS. They want to maintain the peace, which is why we see that there will be a lot of deterrent against like just rogue nations just firing off like AWS to to like bomb other nations or whatever.
Yeah, my question wasn't really about rogues so much. It was about, like, do you have evidence about the United States? Do you have evidence about Russia?
Pertaining to the US and Russia, I currently don't.
I can
yeah.
take this. So yeah, Russia's actually enacted so like we should probably first take a step back and realize that AI is a pretty relatively new technology. This is something the NEG actually states at the top of their contention. So naturally regulation is still in its baby stages, but we've seen a lot of countries actually take action. So I think Russia enacted regulations or like frameworks, actually not frameworks, they're like actual policies, binding policies against the use of AI. And I think in like military occupations. In the US, the Harvard Business Review itself explains the US has actually passed over frameworks that have been a lot more bolder, a lot more stricter in terms of the regulation of AI. And I think this
That
regulation,
evidence says that they've regulated military AI.
the regulation is like, I can like pull up the evidence right now and take a look if you'd like, but the idea is just that like on net, they're going towards more stringent regulations because like, it's like on net good for everyone to cooperate, right? So for example, like nuclear weapons, like if we were to apply the same logic that you're presenting to us right now, logically these nations want to create things like arms control groups or like what the US has right now, right? Because like they saw the destruction that a nuclear weapon could cause. They realized that can also cause like a similar level of destruction according to the negative. And so if that logic is true, that would mean that we would have an incentive to regulate, an incentive to restrict the use of AWS. Like internationally, like if we're able to do that with nuclear weapons, there's no reason why we can't do that with AWS.
Let me just ask the affirmative. If the negative is able to prove that there is a troubling, I don't know what that would turn into as a number, a substantial, a reasonable risk of the application of this, unregulated, of course, they'd have to win that, the unregulated application of military technology via AI in such a way that it has not been able to do before. The immediacy of that, the range, the scope of that, would you or not agree that risk would on its face outweigh the advantages that you're claiming?
Is it okay if I take this one?
Sure.
Okay. Number one, I think just AWS and wars in general, these aren't inherently global, right? Even in the world wars, that wasn't global. That was like a few countries in Europe and Japan and China. Wars don't have to be global, they can be regional. Whereas things we're talking about like pandemics, like climate change, like obviously the pandemic has gone global. We can see that right now, like with COVID, and climate change is a global existential threat. So on that level, what we're talking about here is always going to be bigger than what they're talking about. But second of all, wars are not like an ever-present thing. It's like a war happens, once or twice, but like there's an end to it, right? Whereas with climate change, what you're going to be seeing here is that it's going to get perpetually worse over time until the point where, it's an existential threat and we're all gone. Wars are just a one-time thing. We're talking about something that could bring the end to humanity.
Am I allowed to like add on to that answer?
Briefly.
All right, yeah. So I think something else I need to prove is like an actual scenario where like just because you have like a new weapon means that there's like destruction worldwide. When we had like, for example, the advent of like tanks, perhaps like that didn't lead to like destruction of like countries worldwide. Like just because there's a new technology doesn't necessarily mean that you cause like a lot of conflict or a lot of war.
Okay. Let me ask one more question and I'll shut up. For the negative, what's your best argument? What do you think? What is it you want me to be thinking about at the end of this debate related to the evolving regulation of AI? Why should I? What is it? What's your best argument there?
You can go.
This one. In regards to regulation, our best argument by far is definitely military, and that's for one main reason. AI by itself can easily start a global military catastrophe. AI's impacts will achieve the entire catastrophe by itself. In comparison to other contentions posed by the affirmative, They basically argue that AI will solve climate change or revolutionize healthcare. But the problem there is that it addresses really niche concepts.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that. My question is, what's your best argument on regulation won't stop
I can,
military?
I guess. As far as like, I'm sorry, could you clarify? Are you asking if what's our argument of regulation being?
You're arguing that regulation won't stop, will not prevent the scenarios that you argue, military, economic, ethics, right? You're making those arguments. I want to know what's your best argument there versus what they're saying. If we take the future, and I know we're all predicting the future here, but we're in a world where we can't know exactly what'll happen relative to artificial intelligence and regulations surrounding those. I need to feel good that nobody's going to launch a cruise missile at my house. How do I? What should be my fear there? What's your best argument that these regulations aren't going to work out?
So for our best argument would be military, and military would be split into, first there would be a large scale military conflict. You see the RAND Corporation saying that
right. And they're arguing regulations will stop that. What's your argument that they won't?
May I take this?
Now I want Soham to finish his answer. I cut him off.
Okay, yeah.
And then
right. So regulations won't stop artificial intelligence because we've seen so far that they haven't. The Court of Human Rights has condemned Israel, but Israel continues to have an unmarked border with an automated kill zone.
All right. So your argument is that because empirically that hasn't happened in the past, we ignore those regulations. All right. Affirmative.
Yeah,
why will they stop these scenarios? What's your best argument for why regulation will work?
Sorry, was the question directed at us?
Yeah.
Is the question why regulation is going to work?
That's correct.
Sure. So
Your best argument.
Are we asked? Our best argument pertaining to regulation specifically? All right, yeah. So I think we're winning very cleanly on the incentive level, which is, and I guess empirically as well, we've seen that the majority of times when we've done international regulations, i.e. with nuclear weapons, it's been very successful. We haven't seen any sort of nuclear wars happening after the US has, after we started actually doing regulation on it. We'd also argue that lots of times the way regulation works in this case is that a lot of countries are, when they do join regulations or binding agreements or groups like that, they actually get benefits out of it, such as economic benefits, which is why on net, they're far more likely to cooperate and regulate.
Okay, there was someone that wanted to jump in and I didn't let her jump in. So you were gonna add something.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to mention that with the regulation thing, one of the largest arguments against that is the fact that we've already refuted a lot of the most recent possible regulations. For example, the OECD thing that I mentioned in the construction, the EU regulations from the past week, or very, very recent regulations that haven't shown promise, and also several individual nations. Other than that, Uyghur Muslims are an extremely large example of this. It is a literal genocide, and though there has been regulation on it, it has still failed. There is not only historical precedent of this, ranging from 50 years ago to more recent, such as this year, but there are current issues still occurring, again, Uyghur Muslims, that prove that regulation is clearly not working. And especially as we've mentioned that AI will not be able to solve this, there is no argument that regulation would work in favor of the affirmative team.
Thank you very much. We're going to have the rebuttal statements now. I'm sorry, we're out of time for cross-examination. We're going to have the rebuttal statements now. We will start with the rebuttal from the negative. That's a 5-minute rebuttal, will be followed immediately by the affirmative for 5 minutes, so there's no time gap in between those. So we'll start with the negative rebuttal for 5 minutes. You may begin.
Sorry, I'm muted. Okay. It is an undeniable fact that AI is a tool with groundbreaking potential. What must be evaluated is AI's most probable impact. The affirmative proposes a solution that is incapable of solving existential problems, and even if they were, governments and consumers have shown they are unwilling to utilize them. The affirmative minimizes every negative argument with regulation. The negatives refuted the largest contenders. 3 examples, including international and domestic examples in proposed regulation in the construction, specifically the OECD and EU. Further than this, some of these issues are inherently ethics-based, something regulation cannot address, as there is not a general consensus over where AI should be or should not be employed. For example, biased and malicious actors with cyber attacks. They also mentioned that the regulation is binding. However, when refuting the negative argument, they claim binding regulation would only cause more issues in AI development. The affirmative also introduces climate change as an existential risk. We agree to this, which is why we stress the existential risk of the negative argument. The affirmative brings examples of climate change mitigation, but not a concrete solution. The solutions would require a minimum of 30 years, according to Harrigan. Something climate change would accelerate much faster than this. The catastrophic effects of climate change are comparable to our negative contentions, which are currently developing as we speak. Next, the Harvard Business School finds that the healthcare contention is fundamentally flawed, as the black box nature of AI renders it unusable. This is emphasized by Deep Patient, an AI deemed unusable by medical professionals, despite its proficiency in identifying schizophrenia. Physicians are unwilling to stake their careers on third-party decisions that they cannot understand. And hospitals are unwilling to accept this for obvious liability issues, according to Ahuja. Although current AI predictions may provide marginal gains to clinical decision-making, the loss in predictive accuracy far surpasses the beneficial effect. That is a clear demonstration of a harm outweighing a benefit to us. Even assuming that hospitals are willing and AI works as intended, the lack of equitable data creates discriminatory effects. You can see from Overmeyer that even with correction, 4.6% of Black patients, over hundreds of thousands of patients, is a huge population that is harmed. Moving on to the negative contentions. Hacks found that the pattern of billions and billions of dollars of investment into militaries show that there is a clear sign of an arms race. You have Chinese Major General Ding Xiaorong of the Central Military Commission stating that China wants to narrow the gap between military and advanced powers and is taking advantage of the ongoing military revolution in intelligent technology. You also have currently, in the cross-examination, the affirmative argued that defensive measures aren't inherently harmful. We completely disagree. Israel arming their borders and not marking them is clearly aggressive. Israel has a long history of subjugating the Palestinian population, and the Court of Human Rights clearly shows that unmarking a border and killing anyone who enters that region is clearly a war crime. They say, we also give the example of the Rand Corporation also says that AI undermines nuclear deterrence, and that is an expert of National Security Council members. They also say AI commoditization is a good thing. The USA alone holds 67% of patents, and 4 patent offices in the world hold 86% of them. Similar to how OPEC leverages their control over oil, AI commoditization enables countries such as the USA to manipulate the global economy in their favor, an unacceptable risk, especially that less developed countries are already taking the brunt of AI job loss. In conclusion, AI's military and economic and ethical harms, which risk global instability, economic collapse, and the blatant disregard of human rights, vastly outweighs comparatively inconsequential benefits of magnitude and probability. We can see what is happening right now. China is subjugating the Uyghur population of over 1 million. Israel is subjugating the Palestinian population. Less developed countries are already losing jobs towards artificial intelligence. If we see income inequality, there are several sources that say income inequality will be clearly exacerbated by labor productivity, something that's backed up by history. Right? We can see in the negative contentions that currently deepfakes are being used for harm and harm only. The only beneficial application of deepfakes are entertainment, compared to the several crimes being committed right now. It is for these reasons that we negate the resolution.
Thank you very much. We will now have the final rebuttal statement by the affirmative for 5 minutes. You can start when ready.
All right, let me just pull up my timer.
Sure.
All right, can everyone hear me all right?
I can.
All right, sounds good then. All right. We've agreed that this round comes down to existential harms, and we believe the most pressing ones are pandemics and climate change. Let's talk about both of them. It's like our narrative throughout the round is that AI is super beneficial for bridging the gap in healthcare. Already 100 million people are pushed into poverty every single year because they cannot access because healthcare costs are too high, they cannot access it. However, AI has the possibility to solve this by bridging the gap between rich and poor nations and between the inequality within nations. This is really good. For example, the University of Notre Dame concludes that certain types of AI, such as Google's Seeing Potential machine, is already screening for blindness this for 70 million diabetic patients in rural India for free, that's a population that never would have accessed healthcare anyways. We also argue that they're a lot more accurate. They perform at 99% accuracy versus only 70% from human practitioners. The negative has a few responses. First, they just say that hospitals will never implement it, and they give a myriad of responses, including like high fixed costs. They don't trust AI to make decisions for them. However, all of these just aren't true. Our evidence indicates that 75% of like hospitals and healthcare providers are already investing in AI. They have weighed the benefits and the harms. They believe that saving doctors like 2/3 of their time from not having to do paperwork. They believe having a 99% accuracy versus 70% accuracy. They believe all these risks that they believe all these benefits outweigh any like marginal risks that the negative is presenting. That's why they've already invested like $6.6 billion in AI this year. That's why that number is only growing. And that's let's talk about why this is like really good in particular. We tell you that we specifically need AI to increase drug innovation because otherwise antibiotic resistance will kill 10 million people annually by 2050. We also need AI to help resource allocation in times of like pandemics. Just look at COVID, right, which killed over 3.2 million people. Our evidence indicates that in the future, AI will be able to stop this. They'll be able to diagnose pandemic patients faster because they've already collected data. They're training their algorithms from COVID data. They're learning for the future. They'll be able to predict the spread of disease earlier. They'll be able to find treatments more effectively. Our evidence indicates that they're 100 times faster at producing like new drugs than traditional systems. And that's why like we'll be able to stop these sorts of future pandemics that pose existential risks otherwise. Let's talk about their case, right? So let's look at the bigger picture here. Even if they win both of their arguments about wars and as well as like surveillance and ethical implications, these harms, while like horrible and undesirable, they're still outweighed by the benefits of like preventing pandemics that kill like millions and millions of people, by helping diagnose infectious diseases, which will kill 10 million people per year, by helping treat antibiotic resistance, which also like will hurt 10 million people every single year by 2050. So yeah, first, it outweighs on like magnitude in that sense. It also it's like more clear in terms of clarity as well, because throughout this debate, the negative only argues that, oh, AI might lead to military escalation, it might lead to war. They never tell you like who's going to war, like what countries have an incentive to go to war. The barrier for going to war is very high because of things like worrying about hurting their economies or worrying about hurting economic trade as well as like relationships. They never contextualize that at all. They don't tell you like what types of AI will lead to like what numbers of casualties. They never contextualize any war scenario, whereas we give you specific numbers about how many lives will be saved each year from new drug development. And secondly, it's also, our argument is a lot more long-term as well. Like things like pandemics, we are tell you in case because of things like globalization and urbanization, these are only becoming more and more frequent. Davies finds that they're probably going to see a new pandemic every 5 years from here on out. So these are perpetual issues. The negative never indicates that these like war scenarios will A, even happen, or B, be perpetual issues. So that's why AI solving pandemics is also a very big, important issue in this debate. Lastly, let's touch on like regulation. So they indicate that AI will not be regulated. However, our Harvard Business Review evidence, it's most recent, it's from today. It says that AI is already being regulated. They're taxing makers of AI. That indicates that they have defined what AI is and they have incentive to do so. And more importantly, our evidence from case indicates that every single country has already implemented successful AI regulations, whether in the form of actual tangible regulations or in the form of frameworks. This indicates a commitment to regulation because at the end of the day, all countries have an incentive to prevent things like big like disastrous wars, right? That's why we haven't seen a global nuclear war, because of things like mutually assured destruction. No country wants to go through that. And even if there are rogue nations who want to do that, even if there are certain large nations, like conglomerations of large peaceful nations who want to keep the peace, will always have tools like sanctions as like to back these ambitions and keep the peace. At the end of the day, their war scenarios and surveillance scenarios are vastly outweighed by saving millions and millions of lives through stopping pandemics and diseases.
Thank you very much, both teams. Congratulations, as well done. What happens now is we're going to take a little time, the judges are, and so everybody just kind of hang on, and they're going to consider their decision, and they're going to text or email that decision to me. And then as soon as I have all of that, I will announce the decision here. And then, you know, I don't know, maybe more than no more than 10 or 15 minutes, we'll talk about those. I doubt I'm going to write anything down, but maybe I will. So at any rate, we got about 10 minutes for the judges to make their decisions, and then we will announce the decisions. Judges, if you would text those to me when you are ready,